Marcus Whitfield's own men had seen him personally negotiate the release of hostages without a single visible flicker of emotion, had watched him deliver news of considerable financial loss to grown men twice his own age without so much as a raised eyebrow. And yet it was one single sheet of paper, discovered entirely by accident on his desk by a junior associate, who should never have been in that office unsupervised at all, that finally broke through decades of careful organizational mythology about the boss who apparently felt nothing. The letter itself, in Marcus's own careful handwriting, described in considerable, unguarded detail exactly why he loved me, and the associate who found it, a young man named Theo barely 2 years into the organization, told the story so many times afterward that it became, within months, something close to institutional legend. I married Marcus when I was 29 years old, a translator who worked primarily and carefully with historical documents and rare manuscripts, a career that brought me, quite by pure accident, into contact with his own family through a formal request to authenticate and translate a centuries-old letter discovered among his late grandfather's private estate papers. Our working relationship extended over several careful months before it ever became anything more genuinely personal between us. Marcus's careful, considered questions about the entire translation process revealing an intellectual curiosity I found unexpectedly compelling in a man I had assumed, before actually meeting him in person, would have little patience for the slow, meticulous work I actually did. I did not learn the full truth about his family's business until several months into our growing friendship, a revelation that arrived gradually through small inconsistencies rather than any single dramatic confession, until Marcus finally sat me down one evening and explained, with careful, deliberate honesty, exactly what his family's actual affairs involved. I told him I needed time to consider what this meant for whatever was developing between us, and he gave me that time without pressure, continuing to treat me with the same careful respect he always had while I worked through my own complicated feelings about the revelation. I did not walk away, though the decision required genuine reckoning with fears I had never previously needed to examine so directly. My own father, a retired diplomat who had spent his career navigating complicated, sometimes dangerous political situations, had a considerably more measured reaction than I expected, telling me he had encountered men in Marcus's position before during his own career, and that character mattered considerably more than profession when evaluating whether someone deserved my trust. I remember that particular conversation with my father clearly, sitting in his study, surrounded by the careful mementos of a diplomatic career spent navigating exactly the kind of complicated moral territory he now encouraged me to think through myself. He told me about a specific incident from his own early career, a difficult decision about which local contacts to trust in a genuinely volatile posting, and how he had learned, through considerable trial and error, to evaluate character through demonstrated pattern rather than reputation or profession alone. My mother's reaction proved considerably more anxious than my father's measured diplomacy. And I remember her asking repeatedly, over several difficult conversations, whether I had truly considered every possible consequence of the path I seemed to be choosing. I told her honestly that I had spent considerable time working through exactly those consequences, that I understood the risks involved, and that I had concluded, based on everything I had witnessed during our courtship, that Marcus represented someone genuinely worth the risk despite the complicated world he came from. I found myself, during that entire difficult stretch of careful family reckoning, leaning heavily and repeatedly on my father's more measured, considered perspective, understanding that his own considerable professional experience navigating morally complicated situations across an entire diplomatic career gave him a specific credibility that my mother's more conventional, anxious worries simply could not match in that particular moment. He told me once, near the end of that difficult period, that he had watched Marcus interact with me at a family dinner and had noticed something he considered genuinely significant, the particular attentiveness Marcus brought to listening rather than simply performing charm, quality my father said he had learned, across decades of diplomatic work, distinguished trustworthy people from those simply skilled at appearing trustworthy. Married 2 years after that first authentication project, a small, careful ceremony guarded discreetly by men whose names I only gradually came to learn, and I remember standing at the altar watching Marcus's face as I walked toward him, understanding that whatever complexity his world brought into our shared life, the man himself had never once wavered in his devotion to me. Planning that wedding introduced me to a considerably more complex side of Marcus's world than I had previously encountered, careful security considerations woven into every aspect of the ceremony's logistics, guest lists reviewed with an attention to detail that felt, at times, closer to careful diplomatic planning than ordinary wedding preparation. I remember a particular conversation with the head of Marcus's security detail, a careful, thorough man named Foster, walking me through exactly which entrances would be monitored and which guests required additional discreet attention during the reception itself. I found this entire process simultaneously unsettling and strangely reassuring, understanding that the careful attention paid to my own safety during the wedding reflected the same underlying seriousness Marcus brought to protecting everything and everyone he genuinely valued. Foster told me, during that same conversation, that he had worked for Marcus's family for nearly 2 decades and had rarely seen his boss invest quite this much personal attention in the security planning for any single event. Evidence, Foster said, exactly how significant this particular day actually was to him. The ceremony itself proceeded beautifully despite all that underlying complexity, and I remember a specific unguarded moment during the reception when Marcus, usually so careful about maintaining composure in front of his wider organization, allowed himself to simply enjoy dancing with me without any of his usual watchful vigilance, a rare visible relaxation that Foster later told me he had specifically arranged additional discreet security coverage to make possible, understanding that Marcus deserved at least a few genuinely unguarded hours on his own wedding day. My own parents, watching this same moment unfold, told me afterward that witnessing Marcus's genuine, unguarded happiness during that particular dance had done more to ease their remaining concerns than any conversation could have managed, evidence that our happiness together was authentic rather than simply performed for an audience of still worried family members. The early years of our marriage established a specific rhythm around Marcus's careful separation between his professional world and our home life, boundary he maintained with a rigor that occasionally frustrated me until I came to understand it as a genuine act of protection rather than any emotional distance. Theo, the young associate who eventually discovered the letter, had joined the organization only recently at the time of that particular incident, still learning the careful protocols and hierarchies that governed how the organization actually functioned day to day. Marcus's office, I should explain, occupied a specific, carefully secured wing of the family's primary business property. Theo had no legitimate reason to enter that particular afternoon, except for a filing error that sent him searching for a misplaced document in the wrong room entirely. He told me later, once the story had become comfortable enough between us to share directly, that he had noticed the letter sitting openly on Marcus's desk, Marcus's own distinctive handwriting immediately recognizable, and that his curiosity had gotten the better of his professional judgment before he fully registered what he was actually reading. Theo described the specific panic that followed his realization, understanding almost immediately that he had stumbled into something considerably more private than any ordinary filing error should have exposed him to, and his first instinct, he told me, was simply to leave the office as quickly and quietly as possible, hoping no one would ever learn he had been there at all. He said the specific fear of Marcus's reaction, should his accidental discovery ever come to light, kept him awake for several nights afterward, uncertain whether honesty or continued silence represented the wiser course of action. I asked Theo once, considerably later, what had ultimately convinced him to mention the incident to anyone at all, rather than simply keeping the entire episode permanently to himself. He told me the specific weight of the secret had become genuinely difficult to carry alone, and that he had eventually confided in a slightly more senior colleague he trusted, expecting judgment or concern about his own carelessness, and receiving instead a considerably more sympathetic reaction than he had anticipated. That colleague apparently reassuring him that accidental discoveries happened occasionally, and that discretion about the actual contents mattered considerably more than the fact of the accidental exposure itself. That particular colleague, I later learned, was among the more senior organization members who had long suspected Marcus carried exactly this kind of private tenderness beneath his careful public composure, and Theo's confirmation apparently validated something several longtime associates had quietly wondered about for years without ever having concrete evidence to support their own private suspicions. The letter itself, Theo told me, described in careful, unguarded detail a specific memory from early in our courtship, an ordinary afternoon we had spent together reviewing a difficult translation, and the particular quality of my concentration that Marcus described finding unexpectedly moving, evidence of a devotion to careful, exacting work that mirrored his own approach to everything that actually mattered to him. Theo said he had read perhaps 3 sentences before realizing exactly what he was looking at and forcing himself to stop, though those 3 sentences had already permanently altered his understanding of the man he worked for. I asked Theo once, curious, whether he could still recall the specific language of those 3 sentences even years later. He told me he remembered the general sentiment more clearly than the exact wording, description of watching someone entirely absorbed in careful, meticulous work, as one of the more quietly moving things Marcus had ever personally witnessed. Language, Theo said, had struck him as considerably more poetic than anything he would have ever expected from a man he had, until that point, primarily observed conducting careful, controlled business negotiations. I found myself, hearing Theo's account secondhand, genuinely curious what that particular afternoon of translation work had actually looked like from Marcus's own perspective. Since I remembered it myself as simply an ordinary working session, nothing I had considered especially remarkable at the time it was actually happening between us. One of many similar afternoons we spent together during those early months of our developing professional and eventually personal relationship. Marcus told me, when I asked him directly, that he remembered the specific quality of my focus that afternoon precisely because it represented the first time he had witnessed me fully absorbed in work I clearly loved, unself-conscious, and completely present in a way he found himself unexpectedly moved by. Evidence, he said, that I possessed exactly the kind of genuine, uncompromising dedication he valued most in the people closest to him. Theo told this story to a small group of colleagues within days, unable to fully contain his own astonishment at what he had accidentally witnessed, and the account spread quickly through the organization's newer members specifically, though the more senior figures who had known Marcus for decades apparently received the news with considerably less surprise, several of them mentioning, when Theo eventually heard their own reactions secondhand, that they had always suspected exactly this kind of tenderness existed beneath Marcus's careful public composure. One particular senior associate, a man named Griggs who had worked directly alongside Marcus's own father before Marcus inherited leadership, told Theo a story of his own once he learned about the letter's discovery, describing a moment decades earlier when he had witnessed Marcus's father display a similar, unexpected tenderness toward Marcus's mother. Evidence, Griggs said, that this particular capacity for private devotion seemed to run through the family's leadership across multiple generations, however carefully each successive leader had learned to guard it from public view. Griggs told Theo that he considered this pattern significant precisely because it suggested something enduring about the family's actual character, distinct from the harder, more calculating reputation the organization projected outward to rivals and business associates alike. He said watching Theo's own genuine astonishment at the discovery reminded him of his own reaction decades earlier, witnessing that same capacity for tenderness in a previous generation. Specific continuity he found himself unexpectedly moved to witness repeating itself. I found this particular piece of family history moving once I eventually learned of it, understanding that Marcus's own capacity for private tenderness represented not some unusual personal quirk but part of a longer, quieter family tradition that had simply never been given much opportunity to become visible outside the family's own private circle across multiple generations of careful, guarded leadership. I learned about the letter's discovery only when Marcus told me himself, several weeks after the incident, describing it with a specific, rueful embarrassment I found genuinely endearing given how rarely I witnessed him flustered by anything. He told me he had been more careful since, though he admitted, when I pressed him gently, that he had continued writing similar letters periodically throughout our marriage, keeping them in a considerably more secure location after that particular incident taught him the value of additional discretion. I remember the specific evening he finally told me the full story, sitting together on our back porch after Julian had gone to sleep, watching him work up the courage to explain something that had clearly been weighing on him for weeks. He told me he had debated for some time whether to mention the incident at all, uncertain whether I would find the accidental exposure embarrassing or simply amusing, and I remember reassuring him, once I understood the full context, that I found the entire situation considerably more touching than anything else, evidence of exactly how thoroughly he cared even when he assumed no one beyond me would ever witness that particular tenderness. He asked me, that same evening, whether I found it strange that he processed so much of his genuine emotional life through writing rather than direct conversation, a question that carried more vulnerability than his careful, measured tone initially suggested. I told him honestly that I found it simply another facet of who he was, no stranger than any other person's particular way of expressing genuine feeling, and that I had come to treasure the letters precisely because they represented something he clearly found difficult to voice aloud with the same fluency. I asked him, curious, why he had never simply told me directly the things he apparently found easier to write down privately. He told me, with more vulnerability than he typically allowed himself, that writing had always come more naturally to him than speaking when it came to genuinely difficult emotional territory, a habit he traced back to a childhood where direct emotional expression had rarely been modeled or encouraged, and that the letters represented, in some sense, his most honest attempt at articulating feelings he still occasionally struggled to voice aloud even after years of marriage. He described, that same evening, a specific memory from his own childhood that had shaped this particular habit, watching his own father struggle visibly whenever emotional conversations arose within the family, retreating instead into a careful, controlled silence that Marcus said had taught him early that direct verbal expression of genuine feeling represented something dangerous or shameful rather than simply natural. He told me he had discovered writing almost by accident during a difficult stretch of adolescence, finding that he could express on paper things he genuinely could not manage to say aloud, a habit that had simply persisted into adulthood rather than resolving itself as he matured. I asked him whether he had ever considered working through this particular pattern more directly, understanding that the habit, however endearing I personally found it, might represent a genuine limitation in other areas of his emotional life beyond our marriage specifically. He told me he had thought about this question himself over the years, concluding that the writing itself was not actually a limitation so much as simply his own particular mode of genuine expression, no less authentic for arriving on paper rather than through spoken words, and that he had made peace with this specific quality of himself, rather than treating it as something requiring correction. I found myself, hearing this fuller explanation, understanding Marcus considerably more completely than I had even after years of marriage, recognizing that his careful, guarded public composure and his private, written tenderness were not actually contradictory qualities, but simply two different channels through which the exact same depth of feeling found its way into the world. There was a particular afternoon, roughly a year after that revealing conversation, when Julian, then old enough to notice his father occasionally writing quietly at his study desk, asked directly what he was working on. Marcus told him, with more openness than I initially expected, that he was writing a letter, explaining simply that sometimes grown-ups wrote down feelings that felt too big to say out loud all at once, an explanation Julian accepted with the straightforward confidence children bring to answers that simply make sense to them. Julian asked, following this explanation, whether he might someday write letters too, and Marcus told him, with visible emotion he did not fully hide, that he hoped very much Julian would find his own way of expressing whatever he needed to express, whether through writing or speaking, or any other form that felt genuinely true to him, understanding that the specific method mattered considerably less than the underlying honesty and care it carried. Julian did, in fact, eventually begin his own small practice of writing brief notes to friends and family members, a habit he developed gradually through his childhood and adolescence that I have always privately traced back to that particular conversation with his father. A quiet inheritance passed down not through any explicit instruction but through simple, consistent example over many years of watching his own father model exactly this kind of careful, deliberate emotional expression firsthand. Theo, meanwhile, found himself navigating a specific, unexpected consequence of his accidental discovery, treated by several senior organization members with a new, careful respect once word spread that he had witnessed genuine evidence of Marcus's private character, currency within the organization's particular internal economy, that Theo told me he had not anticipated when he first stumbled into that unsecured office. He said the incident had actually accelerated his own integration into the organization's inner workings, senior members apparently viewing his discretion about the letter's actual contents, sharing only that it existed and described genuine tenderness rather than any specific private details, as evidence of trustworthy judgment. I asked Theo once, curious, whether he had ever felt tempted to share more specific details of the letter's contents given how much curiosity his account apparently generated among his colleagues. He told me he had felt that temptation occasionally, particularly in the early weeks, when the story was still fresh and colleagues pressed him repeatedly for more detail, but that he had ultimately decided the specific privacy of what he had witnessed deserved protection regardless of how much social currency additional detail might have earned him within the organization. I found this particular restraint genuinely admirable once I learned the full extent of it, understanding that Theo could easily have leveraged considerably more specific detail for his own social advantage within the organization, and that his choice not to represent it a genuine, principled decision rather than simply an absence of opportunity to do otherwise. Marcus told me, when I mentioned this observation to him directly, that he had actually noticed and appreciated this same restraint himself, one of several factors that eventually led him to trust Theo with increasingly significant responsibilities within the organization over the following years. There was a particular moment, roughly 2 years after the original incident, when Theo was promoted into a considerably more senior position, and Marcus told me privately that Theo's demonstrated discretion regarding the letter had factored directly into that particular decision, evidence that trustworthy judgment in one context reliably predicted trustworthy judgment in considerably higher stakes situations the organization regularly required its senior members to navigate. I asked Marcus once whether he had ever directly told Theo that his discretion had contributed to this specific promotion, curious whether that particular piece of feedback had ever been made explicit. He told me he had mentioned it directly during Theo's own promotion conversation, wanting Theo to understand clearly that character demonstrated in small, private moments carried genuine weight within the organization's actual decision-making, considerably more weight, Marcus said, than the more visible, performative displays of loyalty some other members apparently mistook for the genuine currency that actually mattered most. I asked Marcus once whether he had ever considered addressing Theo directly about the incident, curious whether some formal acknowledgement felt necessary given how thoroughly the story had spread. He told me he had spoken with Theo privately shortly after learning what happened, not to reprimand him, but simply to establish clear expectations about discretion going forward. Conversation Theo later described to me as considerably gentler than he had feared. Marcus apparently more amused than genuinely angry once he understood the accidental nature of the discovery. There was a particular evening, roughly a year after that original incident, when I finally asked to read one of the letters myself, curious what exactly Marcus had been writing all this time that had produced such a significant reaction from a man who accidentally glimpsed only a fragment. He hesitated initially, a rare uncertainty from a man usually so composed, before finally retrieving a small locked box from his study and handing me its contents, dozens of letters spanning the entirety of our relationship, each one dated and carefully preserved. I remember the specific weight of that small wooden box in my hands, considerably heavier than its actual physical dimensions suggested, understanding intuitively that I was about to encounter a version of Marcus's inner life I had never previously had access to despite years of daily intimacy. He watched me carefully as I opened it, and I remember reaching for his hand, telling him that whatever I found inside, I was genuinely grateful he trusted me enough to finally share it after so long. The letters themselves were organized chronologically, tied together in small bundles marking different periods of our relationship, our courtship, our engagement, the early years of marriage, Julian's arrival, each bundle secured with a simple ribbon that suggested a careful, deliberate organization, rather than any haphazard accumulation. I remember being struck, even before reading a single word, by the sheer physical evidence of sustained attention this collection represented, years of private, unwitnessed devotion given tangible, careful form. I asked Marcus, examining the careful organization, whether he had always intended to eventually share this collection with me, or whether the decision had evolved gradually over time as the collection itself grew larger. He told me he honestly was not certain, that the writing itself had always felt sufficient on its own terms, a private practice that did not necessarily require an eventual audience, but that some part of him had also always hoped, without fully admitting it even to himself, that I would eventually ask to see them. I spent that entire evening reading through years of accumulated private reflection, understanding Marcus considerably more completely than I had even after years of daily marriage. Small observations and private fears I had never known he carried, moments of genuine tenderness, he had apparently found easier to commit to paper than to speak aloud even in our most intimate conversations. I remember the specific weight of understanding, reading those letters, exactly how much careful, sustained attention he paid to our shared life even during periods when his outward composure suggested his focus lay entirely elsewhere. One particular letter I found especially moving, written during a genuinely difficult stretch early in our marriage when a serious business crisis had consumed nearly all of Marcus's visible attention, described in careful, unguarded detail his own private guilt about the specific distance that crisis had created between us during those difficult weeks. A guilt he had never once mentioned aloud during that actual period, instead simply working, quietly and without announcement, to make up for that distance once the crisis itself finally resolved. Reading that particular letter years later, I finally understood the full context behind several small, unexplained gestures of extra attention he had shown me during the weeks following that crisis, gestures I had appreciated at the time without fully grasping the deeper motivation behind them. Another letter, written shortly after a difficult miscarriage we experienced together roughly 2 years into our marriage, revealed a depth of private grief Marcus had never fully shared with me directly at the time, having instead focused, during that actual difficult period, almost entirely on supporting my own visible grief without ever burdening me additionally with the full weight of his own considerable pain. I remember reading that particular letter with a specific ache, recognizing in his carefully chosen words a grief I had genuinely never known he was carrying alongside my own, understanding retroactively exactly how much silent strength that particular restraint had actually required of him during a period when I had assumed, wrongly, that I alone bore the full weight of that specific loss. Reading that particular letter years later brought fresh tears, understanding retroactively exactly how much he had been carrying silently during a period I had assumed, at the time, he was managing with considerably more equanimity than I now understood he had actually possessed. I asked him, once I finished reading that particular letter, why he had never told me directly how deeply that loss had affected him as well. He told me he had made a deliberate choice, during that difficult period, to prioritize supporting my own grief rather than adding his own visible pain into an already difficult situation, a choice he said he still believed had been correct at the time, but that he now recognized, with the benefit of hindsight, might have denied us both the chance to grieve together more fully rather than separately, each of us carrying our own private version of the same loss in isolation from the other. We talked, that same quiet evening, about whether we might have handled that entire difficult period differently had he shared his own grief more openly with me at the time, a conversation that ultimately led us both toward a shared, deliberate resolution to communicate more directly during any future moments of shared loss, rather than each retreating separately into our own private processing the way we had during that first, considerably more difficult stretch of our marriage together. I asked him, once I finished reading, why he had never simply shared these letters with me directly rather than keeping them locked away as though they represented some shameful secret. He told me he had always intended to share them eventually, though the specific timing had never felt quite right until that particular evening when I asked directly, and that some part of him had also simply enjoyed the quiet, private ritual of writing them for an audience of one, understanding that they existed even if I never personally read them. We established, following that particular evening, a new, quiet tradition of periodically reading through carefully select letters together, an intimate ritual that became, over the following years, one of the more genuinely cherished aspects of our entire ongoing marriage, revisiting specific memories through Marcus's own careful, considered written perspective rather than simply relying on our shared, sometimes imperfect memory of those same events as they had actually happened. I remember one particular occasion, our 10th wedding anniversary, when we spent an entire quiet evening together reading through nearly a full decade of accumulated letters in careful chronological order, watching our own relationship's gradual evolution unfold through Marcus's own private written record, a specific kind of retrospective intimacy I genuinely doubt many marriages ever have the true opportunity to experience so completely and so honestly together in quite this particular way. I found these sessions consistently moving, understanding them as a specific kind of intimacy few couples ever have access to, a genuine written record of exactly how one person's love for another had evolved and deepened across years of shared life. Marcus continued writing new letters even after that particular evening, though our new tradition of occasionally reading together changed the underlying character of the practice somewhat, no longer purely private but still retaining, he told me directly, a specific quality of unguarded, genuine honesty he found himself protective of maintaining even within our now shared, ongoing ritual together. I asked him once directly whether he ever felt genuinely exposed by our new shared practice of reading together, given how deeply private the letters had originally been intended to remain between only himself and the page. He told me he had felt exactly that exposure initially, though it had gradually transformed, over repeated occasions, into something he came to experience as considerably more like genuine relief than any lingering vulnerability, finally sharing directly what he had spent so many years expressing only in careful solitude. I asked him once whether knowing I might eventually read a given letter changed how honestly he wrote it, and he told me it had taken some adjustment initially, though he had ultimately found that writing for an eventual audience of one, someone he trusted completely, had not actually compromised the fundamental honesty of the practice. Theo, I should mention, eventually became one of Marcus's most trusted associates within the organization, and he told me once, years after the original incident, that he still thought of that accidental discovery as a genuine turning point in his own understanding of what real leadership actually required, watching a man capable of considerable, sometimes frightening authority also capable of writing, in complete privacy, some of the most tender prose Theo had ever personally encountered. Theo eventually married himself, several years after that original incident, and he told me at his own wedding that Marcus's example had genuinely shaped how he approached his own developing marriage, deliberately making space for his own version of private, disdained tenderness rather than assuming that professional competence and genuine emotional expression needed to remain entirely separate domains of his life. He told me he had actually started his own small collection of private letters to his new wife, directly inspired, he admitted somewhat sheepishly, by everything he had learned secondhand about Marcus's own long-standing practice. I found this particular piece of legacy genuinely moving once Theo shared it with me, understanding that Marcus's private tenderness had rippled outward in ways neither of us could have anticipated when that filing error first sent Theo into the wrong office years earlier, quiet influence extending now into an entirely new marriage built partly on the example Marcus had unwittingly provided. I mentioned this particular ripple effect to Marcus once, curious how he felt knowing that his own private practice had inadvertently shaped another man's marriage in this way. He told me he found the entire development genuinely moving, that he had never once imagined, writing those early letters in complete privacy, that the practice might eventually extend its influence so far beyond our own household, and that Theo's example gave him a specific, unexpected satisfaction he had not anticipated when Theo first stumbled accidentally into his office all those years earlier. We welcomed a son, Julian, 3 years into our marriage, and Marcus's letter-writing habit expanded naturally to include him as well. A small collection of letters Marcus began writing to Julian directly, intended, he told me, to be given to him once he was old enough to genuinely appreciate them, documenting small observations and hopes for who Julian might eventually become. I found this particular extension of Marcus's habit especially moving, understanding it as evidence of exactly how thoroughly his particular love language had shaped not just our marriage, but the entire architecture of how he approached fatherhood as well. I remember the specific evening Marcus wrote Julian's very first letter, only days after his birth, sitting quietly at his study desk while I nursed our exhausted newborn in the next room, and finding him afterward with an expression of careful, deliberate tenderness I had by then come to recognize as characteristic of this particular private ritual. He showed me that first letter once he finished it, a brief but genuine description of the specific moment Julian first opened his eyes and looked, however unfocused, in Marcus's direction, a moment Marcus described as unexpectedly overwhelming despite years of careful emotional discipline built through his professional life. Julian's letters accumulated steadily over the following years, Marcus writing them at irregular intervals whenever something struck him as genuinely worth preserving, a first spoken word, a particular telling expression, all careful observations about Julian's developing personality that Marcus wanted to eventually share once his son was finally old enough to understand and appreciate them fully. I found myself watching this particular collection grow steadily year after year, occasionally comparing it privately to my own quite different upbringing, wondering how differently I might have understood my own parents had they left behind a similar written record of their private thoughts and genuine hopes for me during my own childhood years. I mentioned this particular thought to my own mother once, and she told me, with a specific, genuine wistfulness, that she wished she had thought to keep something similar herself during my own childhood, understanding only in retrospect how much such a careful record might have eventually meant to me as I grew into adulthood. I found myself occasionally reading select passages myself, with Marcus's permission, understanding them as a specific window into a father's private, ongoing love that Julian himself would not fully appreciate until considerably later in his own life. I asked Marcus once when exactly he intended to actually give Julian this accumulated collection, curious whether he had a specific milestone in mind. He told me he had not settled on an exact moment, though he suspected it would arrive sometime during Julian's own transition into adulthood. Perhaps his 18th birthday or his eventual departure for whatever path he chose to pursue, a moment Marcus said he wanted to feel genuinely significant rather than arbitrary when it eventually arrived. There was a difficult season, roughly 4 years into our marriage, when a genuine business crisis consumed nearly all of Marcus's waking attention for several exhausting weeks. And I remember finding, tucked quietly into my coat pocket one particularly difficult morning, a brief note in his familiar handwriting, acknowledging how distant he had been and promising that the distance was circumstantial rather than any diminishment of his underlying devotion. That small note, considerably shorter than his usual letters, nonetheless carried the same careful, deliberate honesty that characterized everything he wrote, and I found myself returning to it several times throughout that difficult stretch, whenever the accumulated distance began to genuinely worry me. That particular business crisis, I should explain, involved a genuine threat to a significant portion of the organization's territorial holdings, a rival faction testing boundaries that had remained stable for nearly a decade, requiring Marcus's near-constant attention for the better part of 6 exhausting weeks. I remember the specific exhaustion visible in his face throughout that entire stretch, arriving home later each evening, leaving earlier each morning, our usual evening conversations reduced to brief, tired exchanges before he retreated to handle whatever additional matter had arisen that particular day. I found myself, during that difficult stretch, occasionally doubting whether the small notes and brief moments of connection he still managed to offer represented genuine ongoing devotion, or simply the automatic habits of a relationship otherwise being neglected under considerable external pressure. I raised this concern with him directly, once the crisis had finally resolved, admitting how isolated I had sometimes felt during those difficult weeks despite his continued small gestures of connection. He listened to this admission with genuine seriousness, telling me he understood completely why the accumulated distance had produced that particular doubt, and that he intended, going forward, to be more explicit about acknowledging the cost that kind of professional demand placed on our marriage, rather than simply assuming small gestures would adequately communicate everything he was actually feeling during periods when his physical presence remained genuinely limited. I asked him, once that particular crisis had resolved, how he had found time to write even that brief note during what was otherwise one of the most demanding periods of his professional career. He told me he had simply refused to let the demands of that crisis completely override the small, ongoing practice of ensuring I always knew, even briefly, exactly where I stood in his priorities, understanding that the practice itself, however small any single note might be, represented a discipline he considered non-negotiable regardless of how demanding his professional obligations happened to be during any particular stretch. I found myself thinking, in the months following that difficult crisis, about how differently our marriage might have weathered that particular stretch, had Marcus not maintained even that minimal, consistent thread of written connection throughout the worst of it. I mentioned this thought to him directly once, and he told me he had actually learned this specific lesson from watching his own parents' marriage struggle during a similarly demanding period decades earlier, his father's complete withdrawal during a comparable crisis having produced a distance between his parents that Marcus said had never fully healed even years later. He told me he had made a deliberate, conscious decision, early in our own marriage, never to let professional demands produce that same kind of complete withdrawal, understanding from his parents' own difficult example exactly how much lasting damage even temporary, circumstance-driven distance could produce if left entirely unaddressed. I found this particular piece of family history clarifying, understanding that Marcus's careful maintenance of connection even during our most difficult stretches represented not simply natural inclination but a deliberate, hard-won correction of a pattern he had witnessed cause genuine harm in the previous generation. There was a particular case, roughly 7 years into our marriage, when Marcus's own father, aging and increasingly reflective about his own life's choices, asked to see the letters himself, having apparently heard about their existence through the same organizational grapevine that had originally spread word of Theo's accidental discovery years earlier. I remember Marcus's initial hesitation about this request, understanding that sharing something this private with his own father, a man who had modeled such considerable emotional reticence throughout Marcus's childhood, represented its own kind of vulnerable exposure. Marcus ultimately shared a small selection of the letters, carefully chosen, and he told me afterward that his father had read them in complete silence, tears visible by the end despite his own considerable effort at composure. His father told him, once he finished reading, that he deeply regretted never having learned to express his own love for Marcus's mother with anything approaching this particular openness, regret Marcus said had never previously been voiced so directly between them, despite decades of an otherwise close relationship. I remember Marcus describing that entire conversation to me afterward, his own voice carrying an emotion I rarely heard from him even in our most intimate moments together, understanding that witnessing his father's genuine, unguarded regret had represented its own kind of significant, if genuinely painful, gift, a rare and precious glimpse into an inner life his father had spent decades carefully, deliberately guarding from view even from his own son. Marcus's father passed away roughly 2 years after that particular conversation, and Marcus told me, in the difficult weeks following his death, that he found himself unexpectedly, genuinely grateful they had shared that specific moment together before it was ultimately too late, understanding clearly that the conversation had allowed a genuine, hard-won closeness between them that might otherwise have remained permanently unspoken between father and son. I remember quite clearly the specific quality of Marcus's own grief throughout that difficult period, considerably more peaceful overall than I might have otherwise expected given how emotionally reserved his relationship with his father had remained throughout most of his adult life, a genuine peace I understood, watching him carefully day after day, as directly connected to that one late, unguarded conversation they had finally shared together over the letters that year. I found myself learning about this particular exchange, understanding something additional about the significance of Marcus's letters, evidence not just of his devotion to me, but of a genuine, deliberate break from an inherited pattern of emotional reticence that had shaped multiple generations of his family before he finally, consciously chose to write his own way past it. I mentioned this observation to Marcus directly once, curious whether he had consciously understood the letters as a form of generational healing, even as he first began writing them years earlier. He told me he had not thought of them in quite those explicit terms initially, that the practice had simply begun as a personal need to express something he found difficult to voice aloud, only gradually revealing itself, over years of reflection, as a deliberate correction of a pattern he had witnessed cause genuine, lasting harm in the generation before his own. We welcomed a second child, a daughter named Colette, 5 years into our marriage, and Marcus's letter-writing practice expanded once more to include her as well, ensuring both our children would eventually inherit their own careful, accumulated record of a father's private, sustained devotion, evidence they would carry forward long after either of us was gone from their lives. Colette's own collection developed its own particular, distinct character over the following years, Marcus writing to her with a specific, careful attentiveness to the particular ways she differed meaningfully from her older brother, always careful never to simply repeat the same observations he had already made about Julian but genuinely, thoughtfully engaging with her own distinct, rapidly developing personality as it emerged. I found myself watching this careful, individualized attention unfold consistently across both children's entirely separate collections, understanding it as further, meaningful evidence of exactly how seriously Marcus took the underlying practice as a whole, refusing to ever let it become rote or formulaic, even as it steadily expanded to include a second, equally cherished child. There was a particular afternoon, Colette, perhaps 6 years old, when she found Julian's own private box of letters and asked, with obvious curiosity, why she did not yet have anything similar of her own. Marcus explained, gently, that she did in fact have her own growing collection, simply kept separately and not yet ready to be shown to her, an explanation that satisfied her immediate curiosity while planting, I suspect, an early anticipation for whatever eventual moment Marcus would choose to finally share her own accumulated letters with her directly. I asked Marcus once, watching Colette's obvious, growing excitement about her own eventual future collection, whether he genuinely worried about the specific pressure of living up to whatever considerable expectation this early anticipation might slowly build in her own young mind over the years ahead. He told me he had considered this exact possibility carefully, but had ultimately decided that any genuine, sustained expression of real love was unlikely to disappoint, regardless of any specific expectations built up beforehand, understanding fully that the underlying sincerity mattered considerably more, in the end, than any particular polish the letters themselves might or might not eventually carry. I think often now about the specific accident that first revealed Marcus's private tenderness to his own organization. A junior associate's misplaced filing error, accidentally exposing years of careful, private devotion that Marcus had never intended for any audience beyond me. I understand now, having read through years of his accumulated letters, that the composed, careful man his organization respects and the tender, deliberately expressive man who writes to me privately were never actually separate people at all, simply two expressions of the exact same underlying character, one carefully guarded from the professional world he navigates and one offered, completely and without reservation, to the woman fortunate enough to be its intended audience.